He bought the house because it was quiet. That was the main reason. The street was not fancy, but it was calm. Trees lined the road, and most people kept to themselves. He liked that. He worked long hours and wanted peace when he came home. The yard was big enough for him to breathe. It was not perfect, but it was his. From the first day, he saw the yard as a place to think and work with his hands. He did not care much for grass cut into perfect lines or matching flower pots. He liked old things. Rusted tools, bent metal, pieces of fencing, and scrap that most people would throw away. To him, those things still had use. He believed that almost anything could be reused if you had time and patience. Slowly, over months, the yard changed. It did not happen all at once. An old metal gate leaned against the side fence. A stack of rusted pipes sat near the shed. A broken wheelbarrow rested upside down near the back corner. None of it blocked the sidewalk. None of it crossed the property line. Everything stayed inside his yard at first. No one said anything. Neighbors walked by and glanced over, then kept going. Some nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact. He did not think much about it. He was not trying to make a statement. He was just living. Then one afternoon, he found a white envelope tucked into his mailbox. It was not from the city. It had the HOA logo on it. He barely remembered signing papers about an association when he bought the house. At the time, it seemed like a formality. Something small. The letter was short. It said his yard did not meet community standards. It mentioned visual clutter and unapproved materials. It asked him to clean up within 30 days. He read it twice and set it on the kitchen table. He felt more confused than angry. No one had talked to him directly. No warning. No conversation. Just a letter. He walked outside and looked at his yard as if seeing it for the first time. The sun was setting. The metal pieces caught the light, orange and brown with age. To him, it looked honest. It looked like work in progress. He decided to ignore the letter. 30 days passed. Nothing happened. Life went on. Then came the second letter. This one sounded firmer. It used words like violation and fine. It listed items that needed to be removed. It did not explain why those items were a problem, only that they were. That was when something shifted inside him. Not anger yet. More like a slow tightening. He had paid for the house. He paid his taxes. He stayed within the law. Why should someone else decide what was acceptable inside his fence? He decided to respond. He wrote a short letter back, polite and calm. He asked which rule he was breaking. He asked for exact wording from the bylaws. He asked for proof that his yard caused harm. Weeks passed. No answer. Instead, a third letter arrived. This one included a deadline and a fine amount. It felt cold. Official. One evening, as he was fixing a hinge on the shed, he noticed two people standing on the sidewalk. They were pointing toward his yard. One held a clipboard. The other took photos with a phone. They did not greet him. They did not ask permission. That was the moment frustration turned into resolve. He walked inside and pulled out the HOA paperwork from when he bought the house. It was thick and full of small print. He spent nights reading it slowly, line by line. He highlighted parts. He made notes. He learned which rules were clear and which were vague. What he found surprised him. Many rules talked about safety and shared spaces. Very few clearly banned what he had in his yard. Words like unsightly were used but never defined. He realized something important. The HOA depended on people giving in easily. On fear of fines, on pressure. He did not want to fight, but he also did not want to be controlled. Another letter came, warning of higher fines. This time, it included a date for a hearing. He showed up. The meeting room was small. A long table sat in the center. Several HOA members sat behind it. They spoke in careful voices. They said his yard lowered property values. They said people had complained. He asked who had complained. They did not answer. He asked which rule he had broken. They pointed to a general clause. He read it out loud, slowly, calmly. The room grew quiet. They told him to work with them. He said he was willing, but only within the rules. After the meeting, the pressure increased. Notices came faster. The tone grew sharper. It felt personal now. One morning, while standing in the yard, he had a thought. A simple one. If they were so focused on appearances, then maybe appearance was the point. He looked at the metal stacked along the fence. He looked at the boundaries of his property. He remembered what the bylaws did not say. That was when the idea began to form. Not rebellion. Not chaos structure. Something solid. Something legal. Something that would make them stop looking into his yard. That was the beginning. And the HOA had no idea what they had started. The days that followed the meeting felt heavier. Each letter, each notice from the HOA added weight, like small stones being stacked on his shoulders. He kept thinking about that one question he had asked who had complained. Every time, there was silence or a vague gesture toward the neighborhood. He could feel the eyes of some neighbors, curious and whispering, but no one spoke up openly. There was fear in the air, the same kind of fear that often made people comply even when something seemed unfair. He spent his evenings walking around the yard, inspecting each item. The broken wheelbarrow, the pile of old pipes, the leaning gate, they had always been part of his life. They were not trash. They were projects, ideas waiting to be reshaped into something useful. To him, a rusty pipe could become a frame for a garden arch. A bent sheet of metal could be turned into a small sculpture. He could see the potential in things others would throw away. But the HOA did not see potential. They saw disorder, something to correct. One morning, he received a call from a neighbor. The voice was quiet, cautious. "They're talking about you," the neighbor said. "At every meeting, at every gathering. You should maybe clean up before it gets worse." He thanked them, but inside, he felt a spark of determination. Cleaning up to please someone else was not what he wanted. It was not about rebellion either. It was about respect, his own space, and what was legally his. The HOA's letters became more urgent. Some mentioned fines that could add up to hundreds of dollars. Others implied legal action. The language was precise, cold, and threatening. He kept all the letters in a folder. Each one, he thought, was a tool to understand their strategy. The more they tried to scare him, the more he realized how little they actually knew about the law. He started visiting the local office of records, looking up property laws, municipal codes, and neighborhood bylaws. He made copies of pages, highlighted important sections, and slowly built a map of what he could and could not do. It took nights of sitting with a desk lamp, papers spread everywhere, thinking, reading, and sometimes just staring at the ceiling. He realized the HOA had a lot of rules, but many were vague. Words like neat appearance or community standards had no exact meaning. If they were going to challenge him, he needed facts on his side. At the same time, he watched his neighbors. Some were quiet supporters. Some avoided him. Others seemed ready to cheer if he gave in. The neighborhood was a mix of people who followed rules to the letter and those who quietly bent them. He started to understand that fear of the HOA controlled more than just yards. It controlled behavior, confidence, and even conversation. It was like walking on eggshells around people who could punish you without clear reason. One afternoon, a man from the HOA came to the door. He wore a tie and carried a clipboard. "We need to discuss your yard," he said. "There are violations, and you must comply." He invited the man in, offered water, and spoke calmly. He asked again which rule exactly was being broken. The man rattled off terms and phrases from the bylaws, but none addressed the items in the yard directly. He listened, took notes, and thanked the man politely when he left. That night, went outside and walked among the metal and old wood. He had started to see his yard differently. It was not just a yard anymore. It was a statement, a test, a possibility. If they wanted to control it, he could control it even more. But it had to be legal. It had to be smart. It had to be undeniable. Ideas began forming in his mind. Not simple ideas, but big ones. What if the yard became something they could not challenge without exposing themselves? What if every object, every piece of metal, every project followed the law perfectly but looked untouchable. It would take time, skill, and patience, but it was possible. He began making lists. Measurements of the property line, locations of objects, dimensions of materials, local ordinances. Every evening he worked on plans, sketches on paper, diagrams, notes. He checked setbacks, heights, and visibility. He wanted the next step to be clear and unassailable. If they tried to find him again, he would be ready. Neighbors began noticing changes in his behavior. He no longer hurried to mow the lawn or hide materials. Instead, he moved things carefully, in ways that respected property lines and local codes. Some neighbors whispered admiration. Others shook their heads. Some still seemed afraid of him, though he had done nothing wrong. It was strange how standing up for what is yours can unsettle an entire community. Then one evening, as the sun was low and the sky painted in oranges and purples, he made a decision. He would build something permanent. Something that followed the law exactly but changed the narrative. He would not remove his metal and old materials. Instead, he would arrange them, shape them, and solidify them. It would not be just a yard anymore. It would be a fortress. Rusty, yes, and old, but undeniably his. It would tell the HOA that he respected the rules but would not bow to vague threats. He began gathering tools and supplies. He sketched out structures on graph paper. He measured distances and angles. Every nail, every beam, every sheet of metal was planned. He worked late into the night, drawing lines in the dirt, imagining shapes rising from the ground. The first pieces went up slowly. A small gate, reinforced and straight. A stack of pipes carefully aligned to form a fence that stayed within the property boundary. Each piece was tested for stability and legality. Nothing blocked anyone else's view or access. Nothing violated a municipal code. But everything looked deliberate and unmovable. There was purpose in every rusted pipe and bent metal sheet, the HOA noticed. Letters arrived, more urgent than before. But this time, he was ready. He documented everything: measurements, photos, legal references. He kept calm. He answered each letter with precision, citing bylaws and local codes. They could threaten, but they could not touch what he had built. Neighbors began to react differently. Some came over quietly, asking questions about how he managed to stay within the rules. Others stayed at a distance, watching the changes with wide eyes. Rumors began spreading about the yard that refused to conform. Some people admired it, some feared it, but no one could ignore it. The pressure from the HOA changed too. Meetings were scheduled, notices sent, and phone calls made, but his responses were calm, polite, and backed by facts. Each attempt to intimidate him was met with clear, legal answers. Slowly, their confidence began to crack. They realized that controlling him was not simple. Every action they took could be challenged. Every fine could be disputed. During this time, he learned patience. Construction did not happen overnight. Each piece had to be measured, aligned, and installed properly. Mistakes could give the HOA an opening, so care was taken in every step. It became a process of quiet determination. He started waking earlier, staying later, working in silence. The yard changed from chaotic to organized in its own unique way. He found himself thinking about fairness and boundaries, not just in law but in life. The experience taught him to observe closely, listen carefully, and act deliberately. Every move had a reason. Every object had a purpose. The yard was no longer just a personal space. It was a message. Not loud, not angry, but clear. This is mine, legally mine. No one can take that from me. By the end of the part, the transformation was already noticeable. A small, structured section of the yard stood firm. Rusted metal was no longer random. It formed walls, fences, and gates. Even as he worked, he felt a strange satisfaction. Not revenge, not conflict, but control over his own space. And he knew this was only the beginning. The HOA had pushed, but he had learned to push back wisely. And he was just getting started by the time the third week of construction arrived. The yard looked different from anything in the neighborhood. What had once been a casual mix of old materials now had structure. Rusted sheets of metal lined the perimeter in straight, deliberate lines. Old wooden beams formed small, sturdy frames. Pipes and tools were no longer scattered but organized into walls and sections, each standing on its own and obeying the exact property boundaries. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, some pretending to pass by, others making excuses to peek over the fence. Their expressions varied from curiosity to disbelief. Some whispered to each other, pointing toward the yard and shaking their heads. A few even waved, acknowledging what they could not yet understand. He kept working, focused, never reacting to the whispers or stares. The HOA, however, could not ignore the changes. Notices kept arriving, but they became increasingly vague. They criticized the yard as still being unsightly, but could not point to any clear violation. They requested inspections and measurements, thinking that perhaps there were small errors they could use to justify fines. Each time he welcomed them politely, offered to show them the boundaries, and demonstrated compliance with every rule. It was a tense game. He knew they were frustrated, but their frustration was also their weakness. The clearer and more precise he became, the less power they had. Every structure he built followed local ordinances. Every fence post, every beam, every panel was documented and measured. Nothing crossed lines. Nothing violated safety codes. They could complain, but they could not take action. He began spending more time thinking about the purpose of his constructions. At first, it was about legality and strategy, but slowly it became creative. He started designing sections that had aesthetic appeal in their own way, turning old metal into interesting patterns, creating symmetry where there had once been chaos. What had started as quiet resistance became a form of expression. The rusty fortress was taking shape, and with it came a sense of pride. During this time, he also paid attention to details others would miss: drainage, sunlight, airflow, and sightlines. He wanted the yard to remain functional, even as it transformed. The fortress was not just about standing up to the HOA, it was about living in a space that worked for him. Every gate had a hinge. Every frame had support. Every pathway had purpose. The yard was becoming a puzzle of old materials, fitted together to make something strong and lasting. One evening, he noticed two of the HOA members standing across the street. They watched silently, whispering to each other, occasionally taking notes. He waved politely, and they froze, surprised at his calm. Inside, he felt a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. Their intimidation had no effect. He had taken control of the situation. The neighbors, meanwhile, began to talk. Quiet conversations were heard from across fences. Some expressed admiration. "It's impressive how he made it all fit," one said. Others were less kind, but none could deny the effort, the planning, and the legality of it all. Rumors began circulating about the man who was not afraid to follow the rules in his own way. The yard became a landmark, a topic of conversation. He worked day and night. The structures rose taller. Rusted panels formed walls that outlined sections of the yard like rooms without a roof. Wooden beams created frames that could later support more materials. Old furniture, once discarded, found a new place as supports or decorations. Every item had a purpose, and everything had a place. What had looked like a chaotic yard was now a fortress in the making. The HOA, frustrated by their inability to enforce fines, began holding special meetings. They debated how to address the situation without clear evidence of a violation. The homeowner, aware of their discussions through community whispers and public records, smiled quietly. Every attempt they made to intimidate him only highlighted their lack of authority in this situation. He stayed prepared, polite, and fully within the law. He also started documenting the process. Photos, notes, and diagrams of each stage of construction were carefully organized. If the HOA tried to escalate further, he would have a record that could not be disputed. This documentation was not just legal protection, it was a log of his effort, creativity, and patience. The rusty fortress became a symbol, a record of resilience. One day, while adjusting a large metal panel, he heard laughter behind the fence. It was a neighbor who had been critical from the start. "It looks like a castle," the neighbor said. "A rusty castle," he laughed quietly. "If it's a castle," he replied, "it's mine and it follows every rule." The comment marked a turning point. He realized the yard was no longer just a personal project. It was making a statement, silently, firmly, and legally. It was proof that someone could defend their space without breaking laws, without aggression, without anger. Every beam, every panel, every pipe reinforced that message. By now, the structures had real presence. They created defined areas in the yard, walls that separated sections, gates that controlled access, and patterns that drew the eye. It was not about ugliness anymore. It was about control, ownership, and clarity. The yard had transformed from chaos to a deliberate statement of independence. The process was exhausting, but satisfying. Long days of lifting, measuring, and installing turned into weeks. Nights spent drawing plans and reviewing codes ensured no mistakes were made. Slowly, the rusty fortress became both a practical space and a work of art. It was unusual, yes, but impossible to argue against. Legal, creative, and resilient. Every day he walked through the yard, inspecting, adjusting, improving. The process taught him patience, focus, and the importance of rules when wielded wisely. He realized the power of preparation, knowledge, and calm determination. The HOA could send letters, call meetings, and make threats, but they could not dismantle what was carefully planned and legally sound. By the end of this phase, the yard had changed completely. What once seemed like cluttered chaos was now a structured, deliberate fortress. Rusted metal had become walls, beams had become frames, and every old item had a purpose. It was a space that reflected his vision, his effort, and his right to manage his property within the law. The rusty fortress was no longer just a response to the HOA. It was a personal triumph. Every piece told a story of patience, creativity, and resolve. Every wall, every gate, every pattern was proof that careful planning and quiet determination could transform conflict into a lasting achievement. The HOA could still object, but they had no legal ground, and the yard stood strong, ready for whatever came next. By the time the fourth week arrived, the HOA was beginning to realize that the situation was slipping out of their control. Their letters had no effect. Their visits were politely met with facts, measurements, and legal references. They could not point to a single violation. They had underestimated the homeowner's determination, knowledge, and patience. One afternoon, 2 of the HOA members came to inspect the yard again. This time, they looked frustrated. The man who usually carried the clipboard seemed uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to another. The homeowner greeted them calmly, offering to walk them through every section, showing the exact measurements and explaining how each structure complied with local ordinances. The 2 members walked slowly, peering at the rusty panels, the beams, the organized layouts. They asked questions, and he answered each one clearly, showing documents, photographs, and notes he had kept from the very beginning. Each response left them more uncertain. Every time they thought they might find a fault, the explanation made it impossible. The frustration in their expressions was obvious, but he remained polite and composed. Back inside the house later that day, he thought about the process. He realized that patience, preparation, and knowledge had become his strongest tools. He had turned what seemed like an impossible battle into something manageable. He had learned to navigate bureaucracy with calm determination, never giving them reason to claim victory. Word about the yard began to spread beyond the neighborhood. People visiting nearby areas started to take notice. Some neighbors mentioned it casually to friends and relatives. A few took photos from the street, sharing them online, expressing amazement at what one person had achieved using old materials and sheer effort. The story began to circulate quietly at first, then more widely, showing that the homeowner's methodical, legal approach was gaining recognition. The HOA, sensing the growing attention, became defensive. Internal meetings were held to decide the next steps. They debated fines, possible legal actions, and how to regain authority. Every proposal they considered was countered with the homeowners' careful records, measurements, and compliance with laws. Their frustration grew, and the more they tried to push, the weaker their position became. Neighbors started showing quiet support. Some would wave when he worked in the yard. Others asked questions about the legal references he had used. A sense of admiration began to form among people who had once been silent. They could see that the homeowner had not acted recklessly or maliciously. He had followed the rules and had stood firm without aggression. One evening, while arranging a set of metal panels into a pattern for a small section of the yard, he noticed a small crowd of neighbors gathered at the end of the street. They whispered among themselves, pointing and smiling. Some nodded, acknowledging his effort. It was clear that his quiet, persistent work had made an impression. People were beginning to understand that he had not broken any rules, yet he had asserted control over his property. Letters from the HOA continued to arrive, but their tone had changed. No longer were they confident threats. Instead, the language seemed uncertain. Some letters asked for clarification. Others reminded him of general rules, but without specific violations. They were attempting to regain control without concrete evidence. Their approach had lost effectiveness. The homeowner documented everything. He kept every letter, every notice, every photograph of the yard, and every legal reference. Each item became part of a comprehensive record, ready to counter any claim. This careful documentation was not just for legal safety. It was a symbol of his patience, diligence, and intelligence. Each day he worked on the yard, the fortress grew stronger, and so did his confidence. As the week progressed, small groups of neighbors started to come by with questions. "How did you make that panel stand so straight?" one asked. "Where did you get the measurements for this section?" Another wondered. He explained patiently, showing his plans, sharing tips, and emphasizing the importance of following the law while protecting personal property. People listened attentively, realizing that his approach was not just about defiance. It was about careful planning and knowledge. Meanwhile, the HOA struggled. Meetings were held to discuss the increasing public attention. Some members expressed concern about how the neighborhood was being perceived. They worried about complaints to the city, social media attention, and even news coverage. Their attempts to assert authority were backfiring. The more they tried to push, the more they highlighted their own overreach. The homeowner continued building, now more confidently than ever. He added another section to the yard, reinforcing walls with beams and arranging old metal sheets into a pattern that was visually striking but fully legal. Each piece had a purpose, and the layout was carefully calculated to remain within property lines and follow local regulations. The fortress was not just functional, it had an aesthetic that drew attention and admiration. On a weekend, a group of neighbors came over to observe quietly from a distance. Some whispered to each other, expressing surprise at the scale and organization of the yard. Others nodded in appreciation of the homeowner's effort. The story of the yard that refused to conform spread through the community, not as gossip, but as a lesson in patience, persistence, and legal awareness. By the end of Part 4, the HOA's power had clearly diminished. They could no longer intimidate the homeowner, could not enforce fines without risk, and were being watched themselves by neighbors who had begun to understand the situation. The yard had become more than a personal project. It was now a public symbol of determination, legality, and clever resistance. The rusty fortress stood as proof that careful planning, patience, and knowledge could turn an oppressive situation into a story of quiet triumph. The homeowner had not only defended his property, but had also inspired a community to see the value in standing firm within the law and making deliberate choices that reflected personal integrity and creativity. The final week of the battle with the HOA felt like the calm after a storm. The rusty fortress had taken its full shape. Each wall, each panel, each beam stood firm and precise. The yard no longer looked like a collection of old, discarded materials. It was organized, purposeful, and legal. More than that, it was a statement, a quiet one, but powerful nonetheless. The HOA sent what would be their last letters. This time, they were tentative, almost apologetic. No threats of fines. No demands to remove or alter structures. They seemed unsure of how to proceed. The homeowner read them carefully, noting every word. Each sentence confirmed what he had already known. The fortress could not be challenged. Without exposing the HOA's own overreach, neighbors walked by, some openly admiring the yard for the first time. "It's amazing what you did," one said. Another nodded and added, "I didn't think it could look so intentional." Even those who had been skeptical now seemed to recognize the effort, care, and legality that had gone into every decision. The homeowner felt a sense of relief, but also pride. This was not just a win over a few letters or meetings. This was a win for personal rights, knowledge, and patience. Every panel, every measurement, every note had mattered. Every night spent reading bylaws, every hour spent building, every polite conversation with neighbors and HOA members had led to this moment. He took a slow walk through the yard. Touching the rusted panels, running his hands over the wooden beams, each item told a story of persistence. Every detail reflected careful thought. He saw the small patterns in the arrangement of metal sheets, the alignment of beams that created subtle symmetry, the way pathways guided a visitor's view from one section to another. The yard was alive in its own way, functional space, and a piece of art combined. With the HOA no longer able to threaten or intimidate, a sense of peace returned. No letters arrived for weeks. No inspections, no calls. It was as if the neighborhood had finally accepted the reality. The homeowner had one, fairly and legally. He began spending more time enjoying the yard rather than building it. Mornings were spent with a cup of coffee, walking slowly along the paths, appreciating the sunlight filtering through gaps in the metal and wood. Birds perched on the beams, insects moved among the plants and panels, and the wind whispered through the small gaps. The yard had become a living space, a fortress only in name, but a haven in practice. Neighbors started to approach more frequently. Some came to ask questions about construction techniques. Others asked for advice on measuring property lines or understanding local ordinances. The homeowner explained patiently, showing them his notes, measurements, and thought process. He emphasized careful planning and respect for the law. His experience had become a resource for others who wanted to manage their property wisely and safely. Word spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Local community boards discussed the yard and the story behind it. Some people wrote online posts, praising the homeowner for standing his ground while remaining calm, polite, and lawful. The story became an example of how knowledge, patience, and determination could turn a challenging situation into a positive outcome. Even the neighbors who had been critical or fearful initially started to see the value in his approach. They realized that standing firm, doing research, taking deliberate action was more effective than simply complying out of fear. It was not about confrontation. It was about understanding and respecting boundaries. While protecting one's own space, the homeowner also reflected on what he had learned. The process had taught him patience, resilience, and the importance of careful observation. It had shown him that power often depends on perception, and that clear, calm actions could dismantle even aggressive authority when executed thoughtfully. The rusty fortress had not just protected the yard. It had protected his confidence, his peace of mind, and his sense of personal justice. He shared stories of his experience with neighbors, community groups, and even friends who visited from out of town. He spoke about how planning, patience, and documentation had been crucial. He talked about creativity and problem solving, about turning challenges into opportunities, about defending oneself without aggression. People listened, learned, and sometimes smiled at the ingenuity required to turn discarded materials into a symbol of lawful resistance. Months passed. The yard remained intact, the structures strong and stable. The HOA had moved on to other matters, and there were no further attempts to interfere. Life returned to normal, though nothing was quite the same. The neighborhood had witnessed a story of perseverance and careful strategy, and the homeowner had proven that standing firm could lead to both victory and respect. The yard had changed the way the homeowner saw his own life. Each object in the yard, once considered simple or worthless, now represented skill, thought, and intentional action. Every panel, every beam, every path was a reminder of what can be achieved through persistence and understanding. The rusty fortress had begun as a defensive measure, but it ended as a symbol of patience, knowledge. In quiet triumph, looking back, the homeowner understood that the true victory was not in defying the HOA, but in the process of carefully asserting his rights. He had not been reckless or angry. He had been methodical, legal, and thoughtful. The yard, the fortress, and the entire experience had been a journey, teaching him lessons about community, authority, and personal empowerment. He continued to maintain and enjoy the yard, not because of the battle, but because it had become a space he genuinely loved. The rusty panels, wooden beams, and carefully arranged sections provided shelter, beauty, and satisfaction. It was his creation, his effort, his victory, and it would remain quietly, firmly, as proof that persistence, patience, and knowledge could overcome even the most persistent attempts to control one's life. Months after the final confrontation with the HOA, life settled into a quiet rhythm. The rusty fortress stood as it had at the end of Part 5, solid and complete. Each panel, beam, and fence section was exactly where it should be. The yard no longer seemed like a project under construction, but had become a permanent feature of the neighborhood, an unmistakable mark of persistence and creativity. The homeowner spent mornings walking through the yard, sipping coffee and observing the small details that had once been overlooked. The wind played against the metal panels, creating faint, pleasant sounds. Sunlight glinted off rusted surfaces, highlighting textures that changed with each passing hour. Birds nested among the beams, insects moved between the plants and structures, and even small plants grew in carefully chosen spots, adding a touch of life to the otherwise industrial materials. The yard had become a living space, not just a fortress. Blending human effort with nature, neighbors gradually became more involved in casual conversations about the yard. Some had once whispered criticisms or expressed concern, but now their tone had shifted. They asked questions about construction techniques, material sourcing, and how to measure property lines accurately. The homeowner answered patiently, showing diagrams and notes, emphasizing the importance of following laws while maximizing personal creativity. His knowledge and calm approach turned skepticism into admiration. The story of the yard spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. A local blog ran a feature about the man who had built a legal fortress using reclaimed materials. Social media posts began circulating images and descriptions of the yard. People were fascinated not by the defiance alone, but by the cleverness, planning, and care involved. Comments praised the homeowner for standing firm without aggression, respecting the law while creatively expressing his individuality. With the increased attention, the homeowner noticed more people stopping to look from across the street. Some took photos, others simply walked by, nodding appreciatively. He did not mind. The yard had become a small landmark, a conversation starter, and even a source of inspiration for neighbors and visitors. It had started as a defensive measure, but now it was also a symbol of resilience and thoughtful resistance. He began to think about how he could use the space in new ways. The fortress was structurally sound and flexible. He envisioned sections for gatherings, small garden areas, and even a place to teach basic building and measuring skills to neighbors interested in DIY projects. The yard was no longer only a response to conflict. It was an opportunity to build community connections while maintaining personal privacy and independence. One weekend, he decided to host a small gathering in the yard. He invited a few neighbors who had expressed curiosity and support during the construction. The goal was simple: show them the yard in its completed form and explain the thought process behind every decision. People arrived cautiously, carrying coffee and small plates of food, curious to see the result. As they walked through the yard, the homeowner explained the structure and function of each section, how the metal panels were aligned, why beams were positioned in certain ways, how measurements ensured compliance with all local ordinances. He shared lessons learned about patience, preparation, and persistence. The neighbors listened attentively, asking questions and nodding appreciatively. Some admitted that they had underestimated the effort required to turn old, discarded materials into a stable, legal, and visually striking arrangement. The gathering was small but meaningful. The homeowner realized that his battle with the HOA had produced more than just a yard. It had created an opportunity to connect, share knowledge, and inspire others. The same rules, the same structures that had once been sources of conflict were now teaching tools and conversation pieces. The yard's transformation from chaotic clutter to structured fortress had also transformed relationships, trust, and community perception. Meanwhile, the HOA had largely disappeared from the conversation. They continued to exist, managing other parts of the neighborhood, but their authority over the yard had effectively ended. Occasional letters arrived, but their tone was neutral, often seeking clarification rather than enforcement. The homeowner continued to respond politely, citing measurements and legal references, but these interactions had become routine and unchallenging. The initial tension had faded into a distant memory, replaced by confidence and control. The homeowner also noticed subtle changes in himself. The process of planning, building, and defending the yard had sharpened his skills, patience, and judgment. He felt more capable, resilient, and self-assured. Challenges that might have seemed daunting before now appeared manageable. He approached daily life with a newfound calm, knowing that preparation, knowledge, and measured action could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. During this period, small improvements were made to the yard. Some beams were reinforced, a few panels were adjusted to improve appearance, and small touches were added to encourage natural growth of plants and wildlife. Nothing violated the law or HOA guidelines, but every change made the space more livable and visually interesting. The rusty fortress, while still strong and defensive in appearance, had become a place of enjoyment, creativity, and personal fulfillment. Over time, neighbors began to adopt some of the homeowner's methods. Discussions about measuring, planning, and using reclaimed materials for practical projects became common in casual conversations. Some neighbors even started small projects inspired by his example, turning yards and back spaces into creative, legal, and functional areas. The story of the yard became a quiet movement, demonstrating that lawful persistence, creativity, and careful planning could yield results that benefited both the individual and the community. Reflecting on the entire experience, the homeowner understood that the true victory was not merely in resisting the HOA or constructing the fortress. The victory lay in the knowledge gained, the patience practiced, the relationships improved, and the legacy of thoughtful action left behind. The yard had become a teaching space, a landmark, and a personal achievement, all in one. As months turned into a year, the yard continued to thrive. The rusty panels aged gracefully, blending with nature. Plants filled gaps,